Alright, 12 Strong is directed by, and I'm gonna butcher this poor guy's name, but Nikolai Fuglsig, I think is how you pronounce it. And this is the story about 12 soldiers who go into Afghanistan. They fight the Taliban, and they team up with this Afghan warlord to help them out, and this is basically their story while they're there. It's sort of weird because I don't think that there's anything particularly wrong with this movie, but there's also nothing that really works about it either, which I found to be a little bit bizarre. And so what I mean by that is that, let's take for example the characters in this movie. I know that they're all based off of real life people, but I'm not judging the people, I'm judging the characters in the movie. And the characters in the movie all felt kind of flat, they weren't really fleshed out that well, they weren't really interesting, and I didn't care too much about most of them, and I think that most of them could have been interchanged with one another and it wouldn't really affect the story that much. Despite having an all-star cast portray these characters, you know, you got Chris Hemsworth, Michael Shannon, Trevante Rhodes, Michael Pena, there's a whole lot of people in this movie, which is kind of why I wanted to see it in the first place, but they aren't able to bring any sort of life to their characters. Even Michael Shannon, which was really surprising because he normally does really, really well with that kind of thing. But what I didn't think really worked was the characters. But at the same time, they weren't necessarily bad characters either. It was just enough to keep me a little bit disinterested, but not completely bored out of my mind. Also, the story wasn't particularly well paced. It wasn't really well thought out, I don't think. I think that the main problem really does end up coming down to the writing, and I think that instead of trying to realistically portray these events, which would have made for an interesting story, instead what they try and do is they make this into a Hollywood action movie, instead of the realistic depiction that I think would have worked much better. And what I mean by that is that you have character 1 who's got a family back at home, you got character 2 who's, you know, making a bond with this random kid, you got this guy doing this thing. There's a whole lot of cliches, and they seem to be going down some sort of checklist to make sure that everything goes down okay. This is also an incredibly predictable movie. Even I understand that this is a true story. I didn't know anything about it going in. I hadn't even heard of it before I saw the trailers for this movie. But I was able to pretty much predict most of the things that were going to happen in this movie. Just because of the way that this movie was structured, it wasn't really anything unique, and there wasn't anything special to it. But on the same token, there wasn't anything necessarily wrong with it. I wouldn't call this a bad movie, but I wouldn't call it a good one either. I think that this is just a completely middle-of-the-road type of movie where there's nothing great about the way that it's directed, the way that it's acted, the way it's shot, the writing, but there's nothing inherently bad about any of those things either, except for this movie does just feel generic. I guess that's the worst thing I could say, is that this movie just doesn't really feel like it does too much with the material that it has. It just sort of goes down this checklist, like I said, of, okay, let's cliche 1, check. Cliche 2, check. That's just sort of the way that this movie ends up going down, unfortunately. Just this checklist. It makes it not really that interesting to watch. If it's something that interests you, read up on the story. I think that you'll get more out of it by reading up on it than watching this movie. There's a chance that I'm a little bit biased because I had a weird experience with it. There was this guy who was missing a leg in the theater who was spazzing out the whole time, and he was on drugs and he was really freaking out. And so I had that going on while I was watching the movie, and it was more interesting than the movie itself, which is unfortunate, but you know, it helped me. I'm not kidding when I say that kind of helped me get through the first half hour of this movie, because you know, they ended up calling the cops on the guy and he got escorted out. It was sort of disappointing, I think, mainly because you have all these very, very talented actors who know what they're doing. They all seem to be phoning it in, and I don't even know if it's necessarily their fault or just the way that they were directed. Unfortunately, this movie just is not as good as it could be, but it's also not as bad as it could be. So again, I'm really just middle of the road, and because I'm pretty much middle of the road, I'm going to give this a 10 out of 20. Again, the worst thing I could say about it is that it's just sort of generic. You know, it's not the worst thing ever, so that's a plus, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, that's all I got to say about 12 Strong. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, please be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.